1, 2, listo, ahora sí tenés. 1, 2, 3. Audio, sí.
Muy buenos días a todos.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to address you all this morning to kick off the opening ceremony of the Inter-American Week of Indigenous Peoples. I'm Alexis Vivas, and I'll be accompanying you throughout this event. Before beginning, I'd like to share with you that we do have simultaneous interpretation in Spanish, English, French, and Portuguese for those who are here in the room with us, as well as those accompanying us virtually. I am pleased to provide special greeting to the authorities honoring us with their presence. The Chair of the Permanent Council and Permanent Representative of Canada to the U.S., His Excellency Ambassador Stuart Savage. Permanent representatives to the OAS, the OAS General Secretary, His Excellency Albert Ramdin, the Assistant Secretary General, Her Excellency Laura Gil, special guests. You are all very welcome. I feel honored to be able to address you all at this event, which is seeking to reaffirm the commitment of the OAS member states to protecting the rights and dignity of the continent's indigenous peoples. The Inter-American Week of Indigenous Peoples is based on showing the perspective and voice of women, visibility, rights, and economic autonomy, which are topics that will enhance the respect for women leaders who throughout their lives have struggled to open up spaces, narrow gaps, raise their voices, and insist on their rights. Let us recall that the Inter-American Week of Indigenous Peoples' Rights was created by the Permanent Council in August of 2018 after having adopted the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2017 and having approved in 2027 the Plan of Action for 2017 to 2021, which all recognize that the rights of Indigenous peoples are a fundamental and historically transcendent piece of our future. And we recognize the presence here of also Indigenous peoples of the Americas and their enormous contribution to the cultural diversity of our societies, and reiterate the importance of their economic welfare and respecting their rights and cultural identities. According to UN data, there are about 476 million indigenous people living across 90 countries. These peoples constitute about 6% of the world's population, yet they are amongst the most disadvantaged and vulnerable populations, accounting for 15% of the poorest of the poor. The original peoples for years have sought recognition of their identities, their ways of life, and the rights to their traditional territories and natural resources. And every August 9th, we commemorate the International Day of Indigenous Peoples to recognize the first working meeting at the United Nations on Indigenous peoples, which took place in 1982 in Geneva. This year, I'm pleased to give the floor to the Chair of the Permanent Council and Permanent Representative of Canada to the U.S., His Excellency Ambassador Stuart Savage. Esteemed colleagues, ambassadors, Secretary General Albert Ramdin, Assistant Secretary General Laura Gil, esteemed representatives of the Native peoples of the Americas, representatives of civil society and of the international community, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Happy Monday. It is an immense honor for me to address you today as Chair of the Permanent Council. And I'm pleased to address you at this 8th Inter-American Week of Indigenous Peoples. I would like to recognize that we are meeting here on the ancestral lands of the Nakotsk and Piscataway peoples. I'd like to pay tribute to them and to their ancestors and would extend this respect to all Indigenous peoples of the Americas. This week, we have the occasion to pay tribute to the rich diversity and resilience and immeasurable contributions of Indigenous peoples to the continent.
Their knowledge, cultures, and worldviews continue to sustain and give us all motivation and understanding of where we live and how we live. They have the right to self-determination, to freely determine their political status and pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. They also have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinct spiritual, cultural, and material relationships with their lands and resources. These are not only legal obligations, as they are, but they are also sacred responsibilities passed down through the generations. Indigenous peoples must be guaranteed the right to free, prior, and informed consent in decisions that affect them and their communities. This is a matter of justice, reconciliation, and respectful partnership. This year, our theme for this week is From the Voices of Indigenous Women, Visibility, Leadership, Rights, and Economic Autonomy. This theme shines a much-needed spotlight on Indigenous women who are the central part of the cultural continuity and social transformation undergoing and being lived through by Indigenous peoples across the continent. Indigenous women are leaders, educators, healers, and activists. They are the guardians of their community's heritage and agents of sustainable development. Yet, they face disproportionate barriers to equality and opportunity. They are too often victims of violence, exclusion, and discrimination. So we must confront these challenges directly and honestly. That means working to eliminate all forms of violence against Indigenous women and girls, and addressing the multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination they face based on gender, age, and social and economic status. We must also create and protect spaces where Indigenous women and girls and youth can define their own priorities, express their visions, and lead the conversations that shape their futures. Empowering Indigenous women and girls is not only a question of justice, it is essential for the well-being and future prosperity of all Indigenous peoples. Our shared commitment in the American Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People and the UN Declaration call on us to turn principles into action, especially when it comes to the rights and leadership of Indigenous women. This week is a call to action for all member states, a call to action to advance dignity, justice, and inclusion for Indigenous peoples, with a particular emphasis on the voices of Indigenous women and girls. I would like to take this opportunity to recognize the outstanding work of the Assistant Secretary General Laura Hill and her team for this, their first Inter-American Week of Indigenous Peoples under their new leadership. Thank you for the energy and dedication you bring to this. I would also like to extend my gratitude to all those from the OAS General Secretariat and member states whose dedication has been essential in advancing initiatives for the well-being of Indigenous peoples. As we inaugurate this commemorative week, I warmly invite you all to actively participate in the activities planned in the coming days. Each event is an opportunity to reaffirm our shared commitment to justice, recognition, and sustainable development for Indigenous peoples. Your support and your engagement honors the past of Indigenous peoples and the continent and helps secure a more just and inclusive future for us all. Let us listen, let us learn, and let us act together so that Indigenous women lead the way forward towards equity and opportunity. Ottawa, my capital city, is situated on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe people, And their word for thank you is megwich. So I'd like to say megwich to you all for being here today and your participation. And let us have a great week for Indigenous peoples here at the OAS. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador and Chair of the Permanent Council, for that very special message. I think it's important to point out that our joint activity with regard to the numerous activities that are going to take place this week to commemorate the presence of the Indigenous peoples among us includes recognizing the unique manner in which Indigenous peoples contacted each other, liaised with each other, politically and economically. They thought differently from how we act and think today. The state of Guatemala, with authorities that include ancestral Indigenous peoples, is a good example of best practices and the precise issues that we wish to highlight in a meeting such as this, particularly with regard to the taking of decisions and the promotion of the Indigenous traditions and means of providing the sustenance for this activity. I now am pleased to give the floor to the Secretary General of the OAS, Albert Ramdin, Ambassador and Secretary General. The floor is yours.
Good morning. Distinguished permanent representatives, their ambassadors, Chairman of the Permanent Council, Ambassador Savage, permanent observers present, delegates from several missions, Assistant Secretary General Laura Hill, esteemed Indigenous leaders and elders, our colleagues from across the Inter-American system, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor and a pleasant opportunity for me to welcome you to the opening of the 8th Inter-American Week for Indigenous Peoples. And let me begin by extending a heartfelt thanks to the Assistant Secretary General and her team for taking this task on her so shortly after she took up the position of Assistant Secretary General. And it's a special occasion as a female to have this responsibility and to deliver on this so soon. I want to thank also your team as well as all the others in the organization which have been involved in making this happen. It's an important occasion that we must cherish. As indicated by Ambassador Savage indirectly, is we all come with some exceptions maybe here, we all come as descendants from all over the world. We are not the original inhabitants of this land, the Americas. The indigenous people are, and they reflect the origins of our history in the Americas. So we not only must have respect for it, but also see it as a source of inspiration, because the knowledge which they have built over the many, many centuries, that's unique knowledge, often not even written, but conveyed verbally from one generation to the other. That is a tradition that we must not only respect, as I said, but also accept. They have equally, and I echo the words earlier on, that the inhabitants, the original inhabitants, not only have gone through a very difficult period under difficult circumstances, but they have now the equal right as all of us on a dignified life and to protect their life and protect their livelihood, which includes rights on land. And I think if we can all adopt that kind of stature, that kind of objective, we must honor their legacy. So this year we come together under a theme that speaks both to urgency and hope. The theme is From the Voice of Indigenous Women: Feasibility, Leadership, Rights, and Economic Autonomy. These principles invite us to listen and to support the leadership of Indigenous women and girls as full participants in building the future in our region. The adoption of the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2016 marked the culmination of 17 years of negotiations. Since then, we have moved from words to action, most notably through the first Inter-American meeting on the implementation of the Declaration, convened by the OAS in partnership with the government of Guatemala and the Pan American Health Organization. That meeting resulted in the creation of the working group to monitor implementation of the Declaration. This working group brings together member states and indigenous representatives, acting in their personal capacity to track progress and share experiences. Among its members are outstanding indigenous women leaders with extensive experience in indigenous women's rights, diplomacy, and organization of the grassroots communities. I look forward to the first plenary meeting of the working group, which will hopefully take place this September in Mexico City, co-organized by the OAS and the government of Mexico with support from CAF. The meeting is aimed to adopt rules of procedure, define a monitoring framework, and elect its leadership as an important step forward after adopting the declaration. And this is why this week's theme is so important. Feasibility must be accompanied by not only political commitment, both in the executive as well as in the legislative bodies and throughout the society. That commitment is key, is the beginning, is the starting point. But it must be reflecting also an institutional voice. It must be incorporated in the governance of our nations. That voice and leadership must be supported not only in words, but really by decisions to be taken. That decision-making power must become more central in our approach as we go forward. As I mentioned at the beginning, I come from a country where we do have indigenous peoples, original indigenous peoples, different groups. The most impressive element of their existence currently is not only their history and all the verbally communicated knowledge, but the fact that they have preserved knowledge and cultural systems up to today in the same way as it used to be, with due respect, which are, in my view, vital for our collective well-being and also the environment. Indigenous women in particular are healers, educators, negotiators, and guardians of cultural heritage. Many of our prominent people in Suriname go to the interior to enjoy benefit from healing through natural means. And it is an accepted norm, and it works. So there is a dignified respect for that kind of understanding of pharmaceuticals. Regretfully, a critical note here, the pharmaceutical industry has tried to abuse that opportunity as well in a commercial way, regretfully. And that should not be the case. So it's not only to aim for improving that recognition for indigenous people, we have to also be more or less a warning institution for abuse of these fundamental rights and knowledge. So their voices must be central to our agenda. And this week, we honor that imperative. From spiritual and cultural ceremonies to interagency dialogues to social media campaigns and the wall in recognition of indigenous people of the Americas, each activity reflects our growing commitment to justice, voice, and belonging. We cannot fulfill this vision, ladies and gentlemen, of the Inter-American Declaration on the broader promise of the OAS without the full participation of indigenous women. And we cannot claim to stand for human rights if we do not honor the principle, nothing about us without us. To all the indigenous women, therefore, specifically, joining us this week in person and virtually, we see you, we stand with you, and we hear you. And now we all have to act to that voice. I thank you very much and wish you a very successful week of the indigenous people. Thank you very much.
Agradecemos al
Thank you very much indeed, Secretary General Albert Ramdin, for that important message. Bolivia and Mexico, as you may know, represent two of the countries of our region with the greatest number of indigenous peoples, plural. This goes to ancestral knowledge and cultural and ancestral knowledge in those communities. Indigenous women everywhere represent a very important minority, and they tend to occupy very important roles in their community. Aside from the cultural and artistic role that they have always had, they, alas, have always faced ancestral discrimination, and that is what has meant that so many of them have had to struggle their lifelong and generation after generation with discrimination, and very often with plagiarism of their brilliant creations and different artistic works. You will see tomorrow an emphasis on ancestral identity, and you will see this at the Mexican Cultural Institute that is just near us, if you wish to visit. Now we have a message from Leonor Sabata, the ambassador of Colombia before the United Nations. Let me begin by greeting all of the indigenous peoples of this American continent, and do so at a moment when we continue to struggle, as we ever will, to defend our principles and our rights. Let me certainly begin by greeting the Secretary General of the OAS, Albert Ramdin, and the Assistant Secretary General, Laura Gil. I thank them both for this kind of invitation. Let me also greet the members of the follow-up group that seeks to ensure that the implementation of the Inter-American Declaration of Human Rights for Indigenous Peoples is being respected, as well as greetings indeed to the various indigenous governments, organizations, and panelists that are amongst us today. Ayakan Augani, those are but a few of the indigenous words I would say to you today. And what they state is this: we women represent the land where men represent the trees and the forests that are so necessary to cover us and to allow us to coexist, the ones and the others. Indigenous languages, we know too, are the first territory on which the rights of indigenous peoples grew and flourished. They are the instrument by which we mothers and fathers can orally transmit our beliefs and our values, our cosmovision, generation after generation. These are ancestral and collective values, and they go to invisible and indivisible. Invisible, yes, but always indivisible in terms of the Western normative frameworks that we address here and that we all share in one way or another. But let me focus today, given why we meet, on the voices of women indigenous who are the vehicle by which we can best transmit the strong leadership and economic autonomy that indigenous peoples have always stood for. In this American continent, North, Central, and South, we have wonderful fundamental instruments that show this and that help us protect our rights. The United Nations Declaration, as we know, on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, and the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, DADIN, also stand for these important values. In that regard, let me simply mention that it would be good to remember the female indigenous among us who have had a particular role in weaving that marvelous link that allows us to continue standing as one against the threats that are still very grave for us all. First, let me mention, in terms of gender, Article 7 of Dadin, which recognizes the rights of women to enjoy the full spectrum of human rights as anyone else can enjoy them, and that pushes us all as states to eradicate violence against women in particular. This is the role that I feel passionately is what has led us thus far and which is at the very heart of General Recommendation number 39 of the Convention to Eliminate All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, known by its acronym CEDAW, C-E-D-A-W, which pushes us all to continue fighting and not to bow our heads in the face of ongoing intersectional discrimination against Indigenous women in particular in all policy circles or manifestations. Let me also mention here the UNDRIP, which picks up on that very fact in Article 22 and demands that special measures be taken to protect women and Indigenous women and Indigenous little girls against discrimination and violence. Let me secondly say that the traditional role of women as those who help women give birth is something we must underscore here. Dadin upholds this and obliges states to respect collective as well as spiritual rights. As Indigenous women and peoples in general, we pay particular attention to respect that role of the women who help other women give birth, the midwives among us. This is does it get any more basic than that? It does not, from the moment of birth. And let me also state, on behalf of Indigenous women, how many have chosen to remain on the sidelines, to remain somewhat aside from the heart of society, as Article 26 of Dadin sets forth. We have said that nothing should be done without us. How can we be sure to uphold that sacred principle when we're talking about Indigenous women who have chosen deliberately to stay on the sidelines of society? This is something that we would do well to ponder more deeply and to come up with how best we can defend the inalienable right of these women to maintain that choice to remain on the sidelines, but to remain also the subject of monitoring and attention that will not be invasive. We want to be sure that all of the defense against extractive activities that is so invasive in the territories of Indigenous peoples is but a few of the elements that should only take place without previous permission by these peoples, and women included, as spelled out in Article 19 of the UNDRIP. Fourthly, let me state that Indigenous women speak of peace. We are, in our hearts, from our very womb, peacemakers. This is what we do. And when we hear the first heartbeat, we know what is afoot. Dadin spells this out by a number of different articles that speaks indeed of equality of gender, but we also speak, let me point out, to the importance of demilitarization in the preamble of UNDRIP, and that speaks very much to peace and security, as you all know. Fifthly, let me greet and pay tribute to the migrant Indigenous peoples. I follow them in my heart and in many other ways. And let us pay honor to them, understanding what is entailed in picking up and going, and not really setting roots in every place, but knowing how to pick up and go where needs to be done. Article 36 of the Londrina text certainly affirms that important right to stay close to those cross-border roots that we carry and that we cherish. Our mobility is key. So, dear companions, and I address here particularly my female companions, stay firm and believe in the importance of what you're doing, in the importance of Indigenous women to continue to be mobile and to be able to have and protect their linguistic interpretation and cultural values, their economic autonomy. Let me just ask the following question to you all as I close, ladies and gentlemen. Here we go. How can we ensure that Dadin can come to the heart of the other universal instruments that we evoke so often? Because that one is particularly tailored, as we know, to the protection of women and small Indigenous girls. How stirring to be able to hear this marvelous set of words, but also through virtual means is present. At least 40% of the 7,000 languages that are spoken on the planet today are about to disappear. Indigenous languages among them, most especially, particularly because most of them, I say again, are not taught in school, nor are they used in the public spaces. In 2019, we held the International Year, on Indigenous peoples. And if you wish to participate in the cultural activities tomorrow, you will learn more about it. This is most important. The challenges will be picked up and transmitted on Facebook Live, should you be interested. The Assistant Secretary General of the Organization of American States, Her Excellency Laura Gil, is now warmly welcomed to this podium.
Muy buenos días.
A good morning to you all. Indigenous peoples of the Americas, women of the continent, women throughout the hemisphere, permanent and alternate representatives before this august body, representatives of the observer states, Secretary General of the OAS, and dear colleagues of the General Secretariat. We are pleased to open here the 8th Week of Indigenous Peoples in the America. We want to remember the past in order to reflect properly on the political and juridical burden that we must uplift in order to help the original lands of this hemisphere to prosper. This year, to that end, we have decided to put Indigenous women at the heart of our concerns. Now, we know that the story of Indigenous women and the stories they told predate the conquest of this hemisphere by the Europeans. We have lessons which we could still learn and would do well to remember through them. But let's be very frank. If it is true that we continue to hold commemorative weeks like this one, that is because our democracies, I believe, have yet to really pay their historic debt to those who are owed that debt. There is no democracy that is perfected without proper inclusion. What kind of sustainable development can we possibly speak of without free and informed consent by those who are presumably being developed? Now, the member states of this organization stand for, I think, a symbolism of respect, of pluralism, and inclusion. But we must also, should we not, go beyond those limits? Surely we should stand here to a renewed commitment to the rights of those peoples, because anyone's rights cannot simply be honored by lip service alone. Can't just be a promise, however good you make it here. Civil society, diplomats, all of us, we must work together to shorten the distance between our aspirations on the one hand and the hard facts on the other. And the facts of the matter are that when we speak of Indigenous women, we're talking about a broad ocean of differential problems, marginalization, discrimination, suffering of so many types. The preliminary report, indeed, that the Inter-American Commission on Women of the OAS shows this. And this, by the way, as you may remember, is in compliance with a mandate by the Assembly. And it shows how the situation of women has not gone to better. It goes from bad to worse. They are virtually invisible in many places. There are two great struggles here. On the one hand, fighting for Indigenous rights, on the other, you guessed it, fighting for the rights of women. Now, these should not be divided. We could make an effort to remember their names, but let's try to do it here, where it relates to the defense of territories, climate change, the preservation of memory, of history, the transmission of original languages. There are too few that have yet to be honored by their places in the universities, or for that matter, in companies. There where they can serve as role models to new generations. Indigenous women's, ladies and gentlemen, don't need us to speak for them. You may be sure of that. All they need is the space in which to be heard. They need to be free to move without all kinds of obstacles. And we know that law should cover them all in all their diversity. Cover us all, I should say. So let us think of this as we truly listen to them this week, not just playing what would the audio equivalent of lip service be. Just listen politely. No, let us truly, truly take to heart what we hear. Now let's face it, the OAS is and remains a space of dialogue, I do believe. And being a member of the organization in and of itself speaks for a respect for conversation. But you know what? We weren't born yesterday, and we know that where Indigenous peoples are involved, sometimes the attention is not the same. But let us not keep that from listening to what the Secretary General said as a basic premise: nothing without me. Participation, I do believe, lends legitimacy to these processes, and that is why I call out to each one of you. Indeed, the members of the personnel, I want the members of the personnel of this organization to feel comfortable identifying to themselves as Indigenous, and let them come to the General Secretariat so that together we can prepare the week on this issue next year. Join us. Now, we have with us Ambassador Leonora Salavata, whom we have just heard, Ms. Xochitl Lopez and Agustino del Carmen Quispeta of Mexico, as well as Ms. Dina Hunt of Guatemala, and we greet them warmly all. This week, we will be upholding these cultures because we wish to uphold diversity as the very heart of the strength of our hemisphere. The mission of Peru has said this, and that is what we speak of, the memory that is shared. And you see this in the Marcos Gardi Gallery. That will be a beautiful exhibition that will be launched today at midday. Go see it. And the Indigenous Art of Canada that will be launched in the Institution for Art in the Americas on Wednesday at 1 and another Thursday at 1. And together with Mexico and Canada, we will have a new work, the new mural, this Wednesday at 9:30 on the Indigenous peoples.
This week, we will be sharing the knowledge and learning to highlight the indigenous voices. At 3 o'clock in the Rubendaria room, Guatemala will present its experience with participatory democracy with the National Dialogue with Indigenous and Ancestral Authorities event. This week, the Permanent Council will be reviewing the progress our states have made in making the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples a truly living document. Our session will take place Wednesday at 10 a.m., and you are invited. The main representatives of the indigenous peoples of the Americas for the Working Group on Implementation of the American Declaration will be there. And this week we will look at artisan women and their entrepreneurship in the event sponsored by Mexico and Bolivia, Creators, Intellectual Property, and Valuing the Artisanal Culture in Bolivia and Mexico. This will be held at the Cultural Institute of Mexico on Tuesday at noon. This week as well, there will be a Facebook Live event on Tuesday at 3 on the International Decade of Indigenous Peoples, and we will be placing a facsimile of Popol Vuh there at that event at the Cologne Library Friday at 11. This week we are focusing on Indigenous women. We will recognize what has been achieved, and we will not turn our backs on what remains to be done. We hope that is a week of honest conversation, building bridges, and making commitments that don't end when the week is over. We hope this week is not the only week where the rights of Indigenous peoples are front and center. From the end of this week, we'll start working on the next. We invite states to choose a theme as soon as possible so we can make this week really the centerpiece of a process of making the invisible visible. To wrap up, I'd like to say this. We can choose to see the glass half full or half empty. I choose half full. I celebrate progress. And we have achieved a lot, as we can infer from reading the SIM report, and I propose that we approach this dialogue with a constructive and collaborative spirit. Let's together work convinced that the rights of Indigenous peoples are the rights of all peoples, and when those rights are respected, the whole hemisphere ends up stronger. This is the 8th Inter-American Week of Indigenous Peoples. It's my first as Assistant Secretary General. I am truly thankful that my office's team, in less than a month, was able to implement this agenda. All the achievements really belong to my staff, and any errors are fully mine. I give special thanks to the member states who responded with enthusiasm to our call. Ladies and gentlemen, as Assistant Secretary General, as a woman, as a feminist, I officially launched the 8th Inter-American Week for Indigenous Peoples with the topic, The Voice of Indigenous Women, Visibility, Leadership, Rights, and Economic Autonomy. Thank you very much.
Obrigado, and thank you. Miigwech to the Indigenous peoples of Canada.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Gil. According to UN Women, Indigenous women face multiple types of violence and discrimination and have done so for centuries. The gaps in Latin America and the Caribbean seriously undermine women's autonomy, and the situation is worse for Indigenous women. Women, including Indigenous women, are not a minority group. They represent at least half of the population. Women and Indigenous women represent majorities, and therefore our theme is so important, the voice of Indigenous women. I have the honor now to introduce Xochitl Lopez Santiago, an indigenous Zapotec woman from Oaxaca, Mexico, who has shared a video by which she will participate in this event. Warm greetings to everyone who sees this video. I'm Xochitl Lopez Santiago. I'm an indigenous Zapoteca woman from the state of Oaxaca, Mexico, and a national counselor for indigenous women. At this week for indigenous peoples, it's vital to recognize the participation of young women and girls from our different communities. It's very important. Last year, Mexico reformed the second article of the Constitution, which specifically safeguards the rights of women and children. Yet much work remains to be done. The implementation of these rights in our communities is happening too slowly. We do not claim that no progress has been made. Much has been made, yet much remains to be done. We need more investments in education and the health of women and young people. Why? Because we know that our young women are not just the future, they're our present, and we need to continue to make efforts to ensure that they can participate on an equal footing, not only in our communities, but in general. We need to continue to ensure that our young women can make a life, move ahead, and create progress for our communities, but they are still suffering from inequalities. Despite all the efforts made by the federal government, thanks to our president, Claudia Sheinbaum, who turned this year into the Year of Indigenous Women. But despite those efforts, we still need to do a lot of work. I keep repeating this because we women working in the indigenous communities have truly struggled to make progress. And it's not just about our communities. Sometimes they say that the progress is lacking because of a lack of knowledge in our communities, but that's not true. We've educated ourselves. We've made every effort to represent our communities. And we have this national council. We women are participating in that, and we're fighting for our rights, not just rights to political participation, but great strides have been made in terms of traditional medicine. Efforts have been made to focus on indigenous languages, seeking to salvage and protect our mother tongues and transmit those to our children, to preserve those languages. There's so much work that needs to continue to be done. So I invite all countries gathering here to focus their efforts, sharpen that focus, not let down their guard, and ensure that our indigenous communities can gain visibility, that the women in those communities, our children, our young people, all can gain visibility. So we thank you for focusing this special week on us, but we hope it's not just a week. We hope that it is a daily effort to foster this, to turn this into a culture. There needs to be a broad culture of preventing discrimination and racism towards our communities. So I invite you to do that. I thank you for listening to us wherever you may be. Thank you very much. We are very grateful for that important message brought to us by Xochitl Santiago. This week centers the voices of indigenous women, focusing on visibility, leadership, rights, and economic autonomy. There's no harm in repeating it. And it's aligned with the principle of nothing for us without us. It's important to mention that Wednesday on the 13th, we'll launch the Intersections exhibit, and on the 14th, we'll have a panel discussion inspired by that exhibit, all promoted by the delegation of Canada. Now I'd like to introduce you to an ancestral authority from Guatemala. I have the pleasure of calling to the podium the mayor of the indigenous municipality of Santa Lucia Ocatlan, Ms. Dina Hun Suk. The floor is yours.
Nashin kwashin sahil chole hil chokere kalentak tut kalentak hau intio shawestak liko pang humehqiu intaka khunach sokkushlis chokke rehtake chinchel wasnichak ken kibirech chapa likir.
Good morning to each and every one of you. It is a great honor for me to be here. I presented my initial greetings in my two native tongues. And a warm greeting to all my Indigenous brothers and sisters here and across the world. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and for your listening to us, Indigenous women. This is a time in which we have broken through barriers and managed to fight our way, sometimes at great cost, to enter such venues. Mr. Secretary General, Ms. Assistant Secretary General, representatives of the member states and Indigenous peoples and organizations of all our countries. It's an honor to be in the Hall of the Americas at the opening of this Inter-American Week of Indigenous Peoples, which recognizes our voice, our history, and our active engagement in building truly inclusive democracies. It's important to always have Indigenous peoples present in all activities of the Organization of American States. In Guatemala and around the world, Indigenous peoples have played a very vital role, and this is highlighted by the fact that 82% of the biodiversity still conserved worldwide is in Indigenous territory, thanks to those ancestral practices and the wisdom that are still serving to manage and conserve and protect the environment under our governance systems. And all humanity is deriving benefits from that protection of that biodiversity. Guatemala is not an exception. There, the Indigenous peoples have shown that democracy is not only defended at the polls, but also on the streets, in words, and in political organization. In 2023, there was an experience that I wish to share with you. And I'd like to commend the work done by so many Indigenous peoples. In 2023, after attempts to deny popular will, to have a coup from the justice system itself, we rose up peacefully, we Indigenous peoples. For more than 106 days, we stood united with dignity, struggling not just for an electoral result, but for the principle that the vote of the people must be respected, and to defend freedom, freedom that was hard-won in our countries. We recognize and are thankful for the support received from the OAS during that time, ensuring that democratic order was respected in Guatemala, and recognizing the fundamental role played by Indigenous peoples at that time. I'd like to highlight the work of the Indigenous mayoralties, these Indigenous structures that do tireless work every day. And we've actually saved the Guatemalan government enormous sums of money through that work. And that has had a positive impact on our country's economy. Our principles of justice are rooted in reaching agreements to maintain peace and harmony in our society. In Santa Lucia Totlan, for instance, each person serves a 2-year voluntary term committed to serving justice that seeks reparations, restoration, and reconciliation. That's our method, and it is part of the living tissue of democracy. But for our democracies to be true democracies, it is essential that government decisions be supported by indigenous peoples. We represent the majority of residents in Guatemala. We're part of the past, present, of future of all the countries of the America. We've recently held a national dialogue amongst ancestral authorities, indigenous authorities, and the government, seeking to promote an agenda that supports our populations. And this includes a law ensuring that indigenous lands can be used for state investment only when our world vision and collective rights are respected and if we are engaged as right holders. This is an example of how dialogue and mutual recognition can result in policies that benefit us all. Next year, Guatemala will have elections again that include key justice roles. The Office of the Public Prosecutor, the Constitutional Court, the Comptroller General, all of this will be of vital importance. And this is important for our peoples because elections and the results of those elections will really make the difference or could mean a setback for us as Guatemalans, especially as indigenous Guatemalans. If those institutions are vital to ensuring that the country improves, because right now the justice system has been co-opted. 2 of our brothers, Luis Pacheco, for instance, who I wanted to highlight, and Hector Chatlan, they were part of the indigenous authorities that are now unjustly imprisoned. In Guatemala, there's been a criminalization and judicial harassment of indigenous peoples merely for exercising their own forms of governance. For that, we are criminalized, and I would like to recall that and beg the states to see to it that this criminalization and persecution ends. And this will only be achieved if, as the esteemed Assistant Secretary General said, if there's political will and if words are more than lip service, if what we say here is put into practice. Indigenous women should be centered in public policy. The interests of indigenous peoples, and specifically indigenous women, should be centered. A democracy that excludes, discriminates, or ignores half the population is not a true democracy. Only through inclusion, respect, and equity can we build more just, peaceful societies. Dear brothers and sisters, the defense of democracy is not something that happens in a moment. It's a path of participation, dialogue, and unity. We have inherited a long 1,000-year history. Let us recall this week that we are nevertheless key actors in forging the present and future of our societies. Thank you very much. Thank you so much to the mayor of Santa Lucia, Otatlan, in Guatemala. In June of 2016, after 17 years of negotiations, the OAS General Assembly approved the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This momentous occurrence affirmed the commitment of the member states to recognize, promote, and protect the fundamental rights of more than 70 million indigenous people across the hemisphere. In 2017, the General Assembly approved the Action Plan on the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples for 2017 to 2021. And in 2018, the Permanent Council adopted a resolution establishing the Inter-American Week of Indigenous Peoples with the objective of promoting the traditions, languages, histories, and social contributions of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. I now introduce you to Ms. Agustina del Carmen Tapec from Quintana Roo, Mexico. She has shared a video message with us this morning. A very good morning to all of you. My name is Agustina del Carmen Tapech. I come from the state of Quintana Roo, the Maya area of Mexico. I'm a representative also on the National Council. Having suffered discrimination as a woman, being a victim of violence, that is the worst that can happen to us as indigenous or Afro-descendant women. An indigenous or Afro-descendant woman should be recognized. The work we do, however small the task, is important. That must be recognized. Why? Because through our work, we support the economy of our family, our home, our household. As public servants, we can perform and work of honor that is the way that we can leave a legacy for our young people so that our children can follow our example. That is what we as indigenous and Afro-Mexican women can leave behind. And we want to be remembered as fighters. We want to achieve respect as women because that is how we can demonstrate that we can do any kind of work as long as it is decent, that we can participate effectively with gender equality and the many different activities for which we have the opportunities in which for far too long we have not been included. And again, we want the respect and the right to health, to education, the right to vote, the right to be elected, to do the political work, to be women that have a position on our lands, that can own or run ejidos. Our children, our young people, whether indigenous or Afro-Mexican, those young people and children, they are our future. They are the ones who come next and who will carry on our struggle. And they will learn through that struggle as we leave this legacy for them so that they can defend themselves against discrimination, against violence, so that they can ensure that they have the same rights to education, to sports, to technology that is advancing from day to day, and ensure that they can lead a dignified life, one without discrimination, without human rights violations. This week, we beg you to keep us in mind as fighters, we Indigenous and Afro-Mexican women, that ensure that we beg you to ensure that we will have the same rights, that we are given what we ask for, that we are not left behind, so that we can keep fighting, so that we can leave that legacy. Thank you very much. We are very thankful to Agustina, who made those efforts to participate despite being far away. Popol Vuh is the story, the creation story of the Mayas that describes the Quiche royalty that governed the northern parts of Guatemala, a story discovered in colonial times. Popol Vuh means the book of the community. It tells the story of the creation, the genealogy, and the rights over the Quiche territories. If you'd like to know more about Popol Vuh, we invite you to the exhibit of a facsimile of that book, which will be on the first floor of this building starting Thursday, and there will be a special event held in the Columbus Library on that very exhibit. It is time now for a video which describes the presence of Native peoples in the architectural details of this building. As part of the 8th Inter-American Week of Indigenous Peoples of the OAS, it's important to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples are custodians of great cultural, social, and environmental wealth. They have for centuries preserved languages, traditions, community organization systems that promote cooperation, the recognition of identity, and a deep connection with nature. Their ancestral knowledge on sustainable agriculture, traditional medicine, and environmental management are not only vital to global biodiversity, they also provide us with a model of resilience in the face of social and ecological crises. Despite historical adversities, the loss of land, marginalization, discrimination, and racism, Indigenous communities have continued to struggle for full recognition of their rights, for the protection of their lands, and for strengthening of their collective identity. Their resilience, their civilizing contributions have been vital to building a more equitable future for all. The OAS main building has expressions of the heritage and ancestral roots that give identity to our hemisphere. Since the building was built at the end of the 19th century, the building was conceived as a tribute to the cultural diversity of the Americas. Among highlights, we see a deep presence of art and indigenous art and symbolism that honors our original peoples. In the walls, courtyards, gardens, halls, and rooms of this building, we see motifs inspired in those native cultures, geometric figures, sculptures, mosaics that evoke the indigenous world vision. A notable example is the courtyard known as the Patio Azteca, which incorporates visual elements from different latitudes of the Americas. They evoke the altars of Copan in Honduras, the monolithic Tiahuanaco Sun Gate in Bolivia, and also we have a representation of the Aztec warrior and the Mexica cosmovision, designs that seek to reflect respect for nature, balance, and spiritual connection with the environment. We also see images of feathers, jaguars, and other sacred symbols for different original cultures. The Aztec Garden is a contemplative space outside the building that connects it with the Art Museum of the Americas. it too has symbolism that is deeply linked to our indigenous cultures. In the center of the sculpture, we have the Xochipilli sculpture. She is a Mexica deity of flowers, poetry, and art. This symbolizes the harmony between humans, nature, and creativity amongst the ancient Mexicans. This garden is not just an element of the landscape. It is an expression of respect for the indigenous world vision. Inside the Art Museum of the Americas, we have the Loggia, a gallery decorated with architectural elements that refer back to the art and iconography of the original peoples of the Americas. In its ornamental details, mosaics, friezes, reliefs, we can see references to the Mesoamerican and Peruvian indigenous cultures. The architecture of the OAS contains expressions of our original peoples, showing the diversity of the region as expressed in the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which we greatly value and we are deeply committed to preserving. We invite you to come see them.
Embajadora.
Ambassador Baños, so grateful for that wonderful overview of these fabulous architectural features that honor and beautify our building. Let us now consider the contribution of one and all to this week. From the Assistant Secretary General, we are particularly grateful for the assistance that you have given us, Secretary General, by being here. Also, the permanent representations here before the OAS that in one way or another have all contributed to this event. Bolivia, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru, to mention but these. Let me also extend our gratitude to France and Spain. Also, a fraternal greeting to all of you who have contributed to these activities and are being able to hold them. To each and every one of you, heartfelt thanks. This then, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the end of this 8th week of the Inter-American Week for Indigenous peoples. We will be happy to see you on the first floor in the Marcus Garvey Art Gallery, where we will be holding a welcoming party, and we hope we'll see you there. Thank you for being here. The meeting stands adjourned.